Man, this is frustrating. So I, like many of you, many of the collective Montreal Canadiens fan base, we all thought that Carey Price would have been traded by now. Heading into September 1st, all the talk was, once he gets that signing bonus, once he gets $5.5 million sent to his bank account, once all that goes down, then it'll be easy to trade Carey Price to whatever team needs a $10.5 million AAV deal to stay above the salary cap floor throughout the season and into the trade deadline period. Okay, maybe I shouldn't say easy, maybe that's not the right word, but it was a pretty reasonable thought for Canadiens fans throughout most of August that, once September 1st hits, Carey Price will get that bonus and then he'll be traded. Well, it's now September 2nd, and even though we have not gotten ourselves a Carey Price trade yet, this is becoming a bit of a roadblock for the Montreal Canadiens and Kent Hughes. And to help us out with what's going on here, we have to refer to a few articles and a few tweets. This is what Renaud Lavoie posted yesterday in the evening about how Carey Price absolutely must be traded. Okay, absolutely must be traded, but he's still on the Habs right now. What gives? The article talks about how September 1st is now behind us, Carey Price received his final signing bonus in the final hours, and the former Canadiens goaltender is $5.5 million richer. Now the path is clear for Kent Hughes to trade his contract. Except, this trade won't be as easy as some believe. The article goes out there and talks about how in years past, we have seen teams like Arizona and Ottawa fighting to secure huge contracts from players who were no longer active due to injuries. The goal was to amass these contracts to meet payroll regulations, which also required teams to spend a minimum amount on salaries. These lucrative contracts were subsequently paid for approximately 80% by insurance, which allowed teams to circumvent the rules by placing these injured players on their roster while paying a fraction of the contract. Today, these contracts are no longer necessarily fashionable because owners are wealthier and more committed to the success of their teams, which means they all respect the current salary cap floor, which is $70.6 million. For Montreal, releasing Carey Price's contract before the start of the year is essential to give themselves flexibility to make a trade that would acquire a second center player. Serious discussions are likely to accelerate this week as NHL GMs meet in Detroit on Tuesday and Wednesday. In short, it'll be a good time for Kent Hughes to move the talks forward. However, Renaud Lavoie writes, with all the teams guaranteed to start the season within the salary cap, Kent Hughes is, in a way, in a weak position and will likely have to agree to give up a draft pick to the team that acquires Price. The other GMs have no intention of giving the Canadiens anything anyway, and I wouldn't be surprised if teams demand a second-round pick from the Canadiens to acquire Price's contract. Kent Hughes will certainly not be inclined to give a second-round pick, and that's when the real negotiations begin. So essentially what's being written about here is the fact that NHL teams around the league no longer have this big necessity like Arizona and Ottawa did a few years ago to get all these dead contracts and just stockpile them up on their team so they could be over the salary cap floor. You're not seeing Marian Hossa and Pavel Datsyuk and all those guys going over to Arizona like you have been in the past. And for Carey Price, you can debate that for NHL GMs, this will be seen as more of a burden rather than something they would necessarily want. Now, yesterday, we did speak about how for the San Jose Sharks, they do want to get some contracts signed, and if they trade some guys away at the deadline, they might be under the salary cap floor, which is why Carey Price's $10.5 million could be seen as a useful thing. But seems like other NHL teams do respect the floor, and they are interested in at least remaining somewhat competitive, which does change the scene a little bit. But then you have what Renaud Lavoie writes about at the bottom, how some teams that are bad, like San Jose, they might want to make trades quickly. Because if they make trades and they send away their own players around the NHL, they can make their teams worse in the short term, which will make them worse in the standings, which could give them a higher chance at drafting Gavin McKenna, which of course is some 4D chess level thinking, and I think it's something that a lot of these bad teams really need to think about because it brings value to Carey Price's deal all of a sudden. When you think about trading away your guys, Gavin McKenna is likely a franchise player and he'll be the first pick next June. Teams that are having a difficult start to the season will make sure not to waste time and trade players with large deals. This is where a team worried about not reaching the floor could be very interested in Price's contract, which occupies $10.5 million of the salary cap. But this conversation might not apply to right now. It might apply to later. So with the Canadiens being in a spot where the rest of the NHL isn't necessarily banging the door for Carey Price's deal, they're in a pretty tough spot. But what if I told you that this conversation here that Lavoie brings up from yesterday, this isn't even it? There's a bigger roadblock that the Montreal Canadiens now face in the Carey Price trade conversation, and it comes to us in the form of the new CBA rules. Puckpedia posted about this earlier in the morning, but there are new changes to the LTIR, there's a playoff cap, no deferred compensation, no paper loans, double retention restriction. There's a full breakdown on Puckpedia's website as to the new CBA things that are going on here, and you could go out there and read all of it yourself. But Marco D'Amico went out there and put this on Twitter an hour ago. With these new rules, it further adds to the belief that there could be trades earlier in the year, especially with the limitations on double salary retention. It makes being a salary cap broker a little less valuable than before unless you plan it 2 months or more in advance. Salary cap broker is like what the Montreal Canadiens would do, for example, when, let's say, David Savard gets traded to another team, but instead of going to the other team with 50% salary retained, he would actually get traded to Montreal, 50% salary retained, and then the Habs would retain 50% of the remaining 50%, therefore 25% of the total AAV, and then he would get traded over to the new team at a 25% total cap hit compared to what he was making before. So this isn't really that crazy anymore. You can't do this to the same effect as you had in previous years. D'Amico then writes here, and the lack of paper loans also means the Montreal Canadiens basically have no choice but to move Carey Price's contract at this point. There is no other mathematical way for them to get under the salary cap with LTIR and paper moves. Unless they went out there and traded a bunch of dudes, but D'Amico says that it's not enough. So Montreal has kind of lost a lot of their leverage here in the past few days, thinking about Carey Price's contract, and I'm starting to believe that this guy might not actually get traded until well before the season begins. I mean, we're at the beginning of September here. I think a lot of us thought that he would be traded by now, but he's still in Montreal, and the Habs have lost a lot of leverage. So with all this in mind, I want you to let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. Even the folks on the RHabs subreddit are saying that all of these new pieces of info kind of sucks. It hurts Montreal's leverage, and they might need to use assets to give Price's contract away. A reply says we were always going to have to use assets. There aren't any teams in a position like Arizona was a few years ago. And unlike in the past, we aren't in a position to take back a bad contract in exchange, since that would defeat the purpose. LTIRing Price would still work. I know it wouldn't be ideal. The Habs would need to pay bonuses on next year's cap. Please explain if I'm not understanding this correctly. You can't LTIR during the offseason. You can after the first game, but you still have to be compliant for that first game. Which is the problem in and of itself, because Carey Price pushes the Canadiens so far over the cap hit that unless they were to trade away a bunch of dudes, they can't be cap compliant. They need to trade this guy. And with that in mind, they've lost some leverage. With all this in mind, let me know your thoughts in the comment section below about the Carey Price situation and what these new developments have in store for the Canadiens. I hope you enjoyed this video. And bye.